Okay, so we're here today for the Legacy Project in Chicago, and I know they're going to talk to you a little bit about what the Legacy Project is, but to me the LGBT history feels like there's not as many books coming out of late. There was this kind of great period of time in the 80s and 90s where a lot of LGBT history was coming out. Can you talk about the importance of documenting our history and where we're at in that?
You know, I think if historians neglect to document the history, it gradually disappears, and it's certainly not brought to the attention of young people who need to know about this stuff. If you don't know about it, it's like reinventing the wheel. All of these rights and privileges that we've worked so hard to get can certainly disappear again. Mm-hmm. We have to know about our heroes. We have to know about people who fought to get us these rights and privileges. We have to know how they did it. And, you know, I have been part of the Academy for more than 40 years. And I hope that my research has what might be called academic respectability. But I've never seen myself as an academic historian. I've written for the community. That's been my goal. I've wanted to tell stories that young people in particular can read and understand where they came from and know what the struggle was in the past and how hard it was to get to where we are today. I've hoped to inspire rather than to be simply an academic historian.
Well, you know, a few of you really created this field of LGBT research. A lot of what you were doing, nobody was ever really doing it before. They weren't seeing between the lines when they had to. It almost feels like we're recloseting people again with like the Ken Burns documentary coming up about the Roosevelts. Yes. What do you think is going on in that, and how important it is to
I haven't seen any of the Ken Burns documentaries, so I don't know what he does about Eleanor Roosevelt and her relationship with not only Lorena Hickok, but a number of social activists. They had a wonderful circle of women that we would today call lesbians who lived in Greenwich Village in the early decades of the 20th century. It's a shame if Ken Burns doesn't deal with it. But as I say, I haven't seen what he's done, so I don't know if he deals with FDR's relationship with Lucy Mercer, for instance. Perhaps he doesn't get personal and erotic in that way. If he doesn't deal with Lucy Mercer, I could understand him not dealing with Lorena Hickok. If he does, it's inexcusable that he doesn't deal with Lorena Hickok. But I don't know that he doesn't. Have you seen the whole thing?
No, but how he's talked about it is he said that he didn't deal with tabloid. He called it tabloid, and he also compared it to the rumors about Lincoln and Joshua Speed. So he was saying there's no full documentation, there's no, you know, that's just the way.
Letters are there, in black and white.
Right. And they interpret
ink and paper.
Right, they interpret those letters differently, and a lot of what your work has been like that.
Aren't many ways to interpret "I want to kiss your upper lip." You don't tell your best friend you want to kiss her upper lip.
You know, it's interesting because fully erotic stuff like that they try to write off, but then they definitely want to say that there was no sexual relationships, even if they slept together or something like that. And that seems to be the case a lot, where they say, well, pre-1900s, you know, that's just the way people talked, that's the way they had to sleep together. How, in your work, do you get around those facts? You know, even in the books you've done.
What I wanted to make clear in Surpassing the Love of Men, which was the first book in which I looked at same-sex relationships before the 20th century, is that, of course, we don't know exactly what happened in bed between any two women. But my point was that these were passionate relationships that often used erotic language. These women devoted their lives to one another in many cases. They lived together, and I documented a number of cases where they lived together and said they shared the same bed and same purse for 40 and 50 years, and who cares what the sex acts were? Those were what I would call proto-lesbians. And whether or not they called themselves lesbians is irrelevant. We recognize those relationships.
Yeah. Now, you have a new project coming up. Can you talk about that book?
Yes. It's a huge history. It's called Our America Too, T-O-O, of course, the story of the struggle for gay and lesbian civil rights. Now, I really struggled with gay and lesbian, wondering if I should call it LGBT or LGBTQ. I decided on gay and lesbian for reasons that I talk about in an early note, but the terminology kept changing. It was sexual inverts at one point, and homosexuals at another point, and those who were hostile to us called us homosexualists at another point. The underground term was, for a very long time, since the early 20th century, the term by which we recognized one another was gay, and it was an umbrella term. Gay included lesbian, it included people that we would call transgender nowadays. It certainly included people who were bisexual, it included people who would call themselves queer nowadays. And lesbian, of course, is a term that goes all the way back to the Isle of Lesbos. So I call it the story of the gay and lesbian struggle for civil rights, but as I explain, gay and lesbian also stands for other groups that self-identify themselves differently these days. So I start in 1948 with a case that almost nobody has written about, of a man who was a journalism professor at the University of Missouri. And it was the start of a terrible witch hunt of faculty and students at the university. I start the introduction that way, and then the second case I look at in the introduction is a woman who had been a colonel in the military in the 21st century, and she was promoted to general. This was just a couple of years ago. And the promotion ceremony was held in Washington, and when someone is promoted to general, there's a ceremony that includes putting stars on the epaulets of the person. Her father put a star on one epaulette, and her spouse, who was a woman, put a star on the other epaulette in this very public ceremony. And the Department of Defense encouraged her, her name was General Tammy Smith, encouraged her to talk about her wife publicly, encouraged her to have her wife pin the star on her epaulette. And so the question that I ask in this introduction is how we got from Professor E.K. Johnston in 1948 to General Tammy Smith in 2012, and what went in between. And then I tell the history, beginning with witch hunts and entrapment and throwing people who are gay or lesbian into psychiatric wards and electroshock treatments, to the early movement, the homophile movement, all the way to the present, where the president lets gay and lesbian or LGBT roll off his tongue so beautifully. And we've gotten rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There's a hate crimes bill. The president has signed an executive order that's not as good as ENDA, but at least it gives rights to many people who work for federal contractors. And we now have marriage in many states, and I'm hopeful that we're going to have marriage all over the country soon.
So it's interesting you started in 1948, since clearly there was always a lot of stuff that happened prior to that. What was it about that
Yeah, well, 1948 was such an interesting year. It was the year that Kinsey published the first report on male sexuality, American male sexuality. There were two classic novels published at that time, Truman Capote's Other Voices, Other Rooms, and Gore Vidal's The City and the Pillar. And Harry Hay at that time was beginning to think about starting what became the homophile movement. He actually did start a group then called Bachelors for Wallace, which was really a group of gay men. It didn't get very far, but that was the beginning of what became the Mattachine Society. And a year later, there was a woman in Los Angeles who published the very first lesbian magazine, Vice Versa it was called. So the late 40s were really crucial for the beginning of a movement.
And my final question would be about the Legacy Project here today and putting our history in a more permanent form for the next generation, especially visible outside. Have you seen the Legacy Project?
Oh, I have, yes, yeah. Yeah, as I'm going to talk about today, as I walked down Halstead and looked at those pylons, I was trying to think of what it would be like for a young LGBT person to see those things, and I was remembering what it was like for me as a young lesbian in the 1950s, how that would have been beyond my wildest dreams. Nobody ever told me that all of these icons who contributed so much to culture, to world culture, were lesbian or gay or transgender. It's got to feel terrific for young people to see that sort of thing.
Great. Okay.